Constantinople fell not because its walls were weak, but because history had changed the meaning of strength. For 1,000 years, the city stood as the armored idea of Rome. In AD 1453, that idea met gunpowder, state ambition, and a ruthless new arithmetic of power. What collapsed was not merely a capital, but an entire theory of civilization. Constantinople was never simply a city. It was the imperial hinge of the medieval world, the gate between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, the broker between Europe and Asia, the treasury of customs, diplomacy, ceremony, and strategic memory. For centuries, the Theodosian walls had acted as the great breakwater of history. Avars, Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Rus had all marched upon these fortifications, only to find that human will, no matter how fierce, could not argue with 5 miles of layered limestone and brick. To hold Constantinople was to influence trade routes, naval movement, grain flows, and sacred prestige all at once. Empires do not often possess such places. They are usually possessed by them. For an entire millennium, this city had done more than enrich rulers. It had conferred an almost divine legitimacy. It had allowed struggling dynasties to drape themselves in the mantle of Rome, not as a desperate nostalgia, but as a living, breathing political fact. Yet, by the middle of the 15th century, the Byzantine Empire existed inside one of history's cruelest paradoxes. Its symbolic capital remained enormous. Its material capital had nearly vanished. The state that had once legislated for continents, that had commanded vast field armies and dictated terms to the known world, had been reduced largely to Constantinople itself, a few isolated fragments in the Peloponnese, and a reputation far too majestic for its empty treasury to support. The imperial court still carried out intricate rituals fashioned for a universal monarchy. But rituals cannot garrison walls. Prestige cannot mint enough coins. Memory cannot recruit enough soldiers. The empire still looked like history. It no longer functioned like power. The long erosion of this great state had many causes, from shifting trade winds to aristocratic civil wars, but one wound remained unforgettable: the catastrophe of AD 1204. When the Fourth Crusade, sworn in Christian language and marching under the banner of the cross, turned and violently sacked Constantinople, the disaster did far more than strip gold from palaces and relics from churches. It permanently shattered the political coherence of the Byzantine world. It redirected the wealth of the East into the banking houses of Venice and Genoa. It embittered Greek and Latin Christendom so deeply that later appeals for military unity often sounded less like strategy than like insults wrapped in theology. The city was eventually recovered by Byzantine hands in 1261, but recovery is not restoration. Some shocks destroy the trust of a civilization more efficiently than armies destroy its walls. The sack of 1204 left behind a Byzantium that still possessed the memory of an empire, but no longer possessed the integrated, taxable strength that had made that empire durable. That fracture mattered profoundly because the world around Constantinople did not stand still. On the opposite arc of history stood the Ottomans. They were not a random eruption of nomadic raiders from the frontier. They were a highly disciplined, constantly expanding state that had spent generations learning the difficult arts that make conquest permanent: vassal management, ruthless tax extraction, rapid military mobilization, dynastic control, and sophisticated siegecraft. The Ottoman polity had grown rapidly in the pressure zone between weakened Byzantine authority, fragmented Anatolian warlords, vicious Balkan rivalries, and the fading, uncoordinated capacity of Western crusading coalitions. Such chaotic conditions do not merely reward violence. They reward organized violence. By the dawn of 1453, the Ottoman state had evolved into the most dynamic, adaptable military and political machine in the Eastern Mediterranean. Geography, which had once been the city's greatest ally, then tightened the noose. Ottoman control in both the Balkans and Anatolia increasingly isolated Constantinople. The city remained formidable in its physical design, but high-level strategy had turned it into a kind of island on land. It sat behind its magnificent walls while hostile power thickened around it year by year, decade by decade. This is one of history's recurring, tragic ironies. Fortifications can preserve a city's dignity long after they cease to preserve its strategic freedom. Constantinople still looked unconquered, but it was being systematically suffocated. Its enemies could decide the tempo of diplomatic pressure, regulate access to food and trade, and narrow the emperor's options until survival itself became a matter of waiting for the enemy to hesitate. And the new Sultan was not a man given to hesitation. Europe added yet another layer of tragedy to this tightening siege. In grand sermons and papal proclamations, Constantinople was declared sacred, the great eastern bastion of Christendom that must be preserved at all costs. But when the hour required action, calculation swiftly replaced rhetoric. Italian trade interests, dynastic disputes in France and England, papal politics, local Italian wars, and fierce ecclesiastical rivalry repeatedly diluted any real commitment to the city's survival. Symbolic importance far exceeded practical resolve. The city was mourned in advance by many monarchs who would not spend a single gold coin to save it. Such contradictions are not unusual in history. Civilizations routinely sing praises to the strategic assets they are unwilling to fund. They call places indispensable only after allowing them to become indefensible. By AD 1453, then, the central question of the age had permanently changed. The issue was no longer whether Byzantium could miraculously recover its lost empire. That era had passed into myth. The true question was whether an ancient imperial symbol could survive at all in a world already rebalanced around newer institutions, larger treasuries, more centralized military systems, and thermodynamic weapons that punished any state unable to regenerate resources at an industrial scale. Constantinople stood at the perilous intersection of two ages, one still clothed in the velvet of sacred universality, the other increasingly governed by iron, logistics, cash flow, and brutal technological adaptation. At the center of this attacking age stood Sultan Mehmed II. Posterity, particularly in the West, often flattens him into a romantic caricature of youthful ambition, a hot-blooded prince seeking glory. But such simplification completely obscures the cold seriousness of his strategic mind. Mehmed understood with perfect clarity that taking Constantinople would solve multiple existential problems simultaneously. Militarily, it would secure the vital Ottoman communications between their expanding European and Asian territories, removing a permanent dagger pointed at the heart of his realm. Dynastically, it would crown his legitimacy beyond any internal dispute. Ideologically, it would announce to rivals and subjects alike that the Ottoman ruler was no longer merely a successful frontier sovereign expanding by opportunity, but the master of a world capital. This is what distinguished Mehmed's project from ordinary conquest. He was not simply reducing an enemy stronghold. He was seizing a civilizational throne. Opposite him stood Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos, one of history's tragic rulers in the highest, most classical sense. Not a man ruined by an excess of options, but a sovereign forced to make decisions with almost none. He commanded far too few troops, virtually no revenue, and operated in an utterly uncertain international environment. The population of his city had endured generations of contraction. Huge swaths of Constantinople were now merely walled villages separated by overgrown ruins. Imperial territory had thinned to a ghost. Institutional depth had narrowed to a handful of noble families. External promises from the West were plentiful, but as Constantine well knew, promises are the cheapest currency in geopolitics. Yet, despite this overwhelming scarcity, Constantine still had to govern morale, diplomacy, and defense as though the imperial dignity of Rome remained a tangible strategic asset. In a certain sense, it did. A city under siege does not endure by masonry alone. It endures by conviction, by habit, by the refusal of its elites and defenders to conclude too soon that the verdict of history has already been written. But conviction requires time to build, and Mehmed prepared an entire war machine to deny him that time. In AD 1452, a full year before the siege, Mehmed ordered the construction of a massive fortress, Rumeli Hizari, on the European shore of the Bosporus. It was built with astonishing speed, directly tightening Ottoman control over the critical maritime access from the Black Sea. This was far more than a fortress. It was a geopolitical proclamation. The strangulation of Constantinople was no longer hypothetical. It had become official state policy, engineered in stone and strictly enforced by artillery. States reveal their true seriousness not by their diplomatic declarations, but by their infrastructure. Rumeli Hizari announced to the world that the Ottomans intended to regulate the city's lifelines and systematically transform pressure into inevitability. Then came the great bombards, the weapons most famously associated with the Hungarian engineer Orban. The introduction of these massive cannons is often remembered as though sheer firepower alone toppled the city. That interpretation is too simple. Gunpowder artillery did not render all walls obsolete overnight. The Theodosian walls remained among the greatest defensive structures ever conceived, the product of a defensive tradition refined over centuries of warfare. But what artillery did was permanently alter the economics and the tempo of siege warfare. In previous centuries, walls had forced attackers into prolonged labor, brutal attrition, slow starvation, and the whims of chance. Now, the defenders had to repair massive stone breaches at the rapid pace of repeated industrial destruction. That shift mattered enormously. The strategic burden no longer rested only on whether the ancient walls could stand, but on whether the impoverished society behind them could sustain the constant repair, the grueling labor, the tight command, and the psychological morale under relentless, deafening bombardment. The asymmetry between the two sides was stark and terrifying. The Ottoman host brought overwhelming numbers, massive siege artillery, highly trained engineers, a powerful fleet, meticulous logistical preparation, and the endless demographic depth of a growing state. The defenders, by contrast, numbered only in the few thousands. Among them were invaluable Genoese troops under the command of Giovanni Giustiniani, a master of siege warfare whose professionalism would prove absolutely critical to the city's survival. This was not a balanced contest of force. It was a contest of time. Mehmed had to break the city before the staggering cost, sweeping disease, mounting frustration, or potential damage to his prestige weakened his campaign. Constantine, conversely, had to hold the walls long enough for Ottoman confidence to fray, or for a foreign intervention to finally materialize. One side fought for unstoppable momentum, the other fought for agonizing delay. In that fundamental asymmetry lies the pure strategic skeleton of the siege of Constantinople. Yet, even at the very edge of extinction, the internal politics of the city remained highly poisonous. Desperate Byzantine efforts to secure Western military aid through a formal reunion of the Eastern and Western churches provoked fierce, sometimes violent opposition inside Constantinople. To some deeply devout citizens, doctrinal concession to the Pope appeared spiritually intolerable, perhaps even a betrayal more frightening than military conquest itself. To others, particularly the emperor and his diplomats, such resistance looked like suicidal purity in the face of obvious, imminent danger. History repeatedly demonstrates a harsh, uncomfortable truth. Communities under existential threat do not automatically become more unified or coherent. Extreme pressure can sharpen internal fractures rather than heal them. Identity, especially when it is tied to deeply held sacred meaning, does not become less combustible merely because an enemy army gathers outside the gates. Thus, both leaders confronted vast strategic dilemmas shaped by scarcity and uncertainty. Mehmed needed a decisive, unquestionable result before a failed siege damaged his burgeoning authority. Young rulers, particularly in volatile empires, are rarely granted the luxury of an expensive failure. Constantine, by contrast, needed endurance to function as his primary policy. Every single day the city held made Ottoman success costlier and Christian inaction more shameful. Every repaired breach in the dead of night argued that the ancient capital was not yet ready to submit to the brutal arithmetic of the Sultan. Yet the arithmetic remained relentless. Numbers, gunpowder, sheer labor, and supply chains are not the glamorous forces of history. But they are the forces that often decide which stories survive long enough to become myths. One of Constantinople's greatest remaining advantages still lay in the waters of the Golden Horn, protected by a massive iron chain that stretched across the harbor, blocking hostile naval penetration. This defensive system represented the genius logic of the old city at its most elegant. Layered barriers, tightly controlled access, and the masterful harnessing of geography to compensate for finite manpower. But old systems contain assumptions, and assumptions instantly become fatal vulnerabilities when a highly imaginative enemy refuses to take the expected route. The coming clash would reveal whether sheer ingenuity could outflank stone, and whether inherited medieval defenses could adapt before bold innovation permanently altered the geometry of the battlefield itself. When the Great Siege formally began in April 1453, it unfolded not as a ceremonial ending, a quiet fading of the light, but as a fierce, grinding duel between engineering and endurance. Ottoman artillery ruthlessly battered the ancient walls, turning sections of them into rubble, but the defenders repeatedly and heroically repaired the breaches by night, using timber, earth, and whatever they could scavenge. Desperate counterattacks checked some of the initial Ottoman advances. New defensive works were hastily improvised. Commanders rapidly recalculated their positions under intense pressure. This matters deeply because inevitability is almost always invented after the fact. The city of Constantinople did not passively await its extinction. It defended itself intelligently, stubbornly, and with considerable tactical skill. The old empire was materially exhausted, certainly, but it was not mentally dead. Still, the fundamental nature of sieges is that they corrode certainty. Ottoman trenches crept ever closer. Massive infantry assaults failed, leaving thousands dead in the moat. New bombardments opened fresh, terrifying damage that had to be triaged rather than fully repaired. In both camps, vital information arrived fragmented and often misleading. Severe fatigue altered the judgment of generals. Rumor became a highly potent strategic factor. Morale among the defenders surged after a successful defense of the walls, and then plummeted wildly when fresh breaches appeared the next morning. The great truth of siege warfare is that certainty erodes much faster than stone. Commanders on both sides operate in a dense fog of war intensified by strict confinement, endless repetition, and profound physical exhaustion. Every local success can disguise a wider vulnerability. Every repulse can conceal a dwindling reserve of ultimate strength. Then came one of Sultan Mehmed's most famous, imaginative, and significant moves: the transport of Ottoman ships over land, rolling them on greased logs across the hills of Galata, and dropping them directly into the waters of the Golden Horn. This astonishing act has often been treated by historians as a piece of theatrical brilliance, and it was certainly a bold spectacle. But its deeper, truer significance was strategic rather than dramatic. It completely shattered a core defensive assumption. The Great Iron Chain had not merely blocked ships. It had stabilized the defenders' understanding of the battle space. It allowed them to focus their meager troops on the land walls. Once Ottoman vessels appeared exactly where established logic said they should never be, the entire geometry of the siege changed. Defensive pressure multiplied instantly. Already scarce resources had to be redistributed to guard the seawalls. Psychological confidence suffered a devastating blow. Mehmed had not simply attacked the physical walls of the city. He had brilliantly attacked the city's mental map of safety. The defenders still fiercely resisted. Here, the role of the Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani became absolutely central to the survival of the city. In desperate, failing defenses, cohesion almost always depends on a few trusted figures whose sheer competence converts creeping panic into disciplined action. Giustiniani was exactly one of those figures. His fearless leadership at the most heavily damaged sections of the walls helped organize resistance where the bombardment and the Ottoman infantry assaults were most intense. Men caught in collapsing situations do not merely ask whether physical positions can be held. They look to their commanders and ask whether the leaders beside them still believe those positions can be held. Courage and confidence are deeply contagious. But so is disintegration. Mehmed fully grasped that the city had to be exhausted, not merely breached. Therefore, Ottoman pressure became increasingly coordinated, a masterpiece of combined arms. Artillery did not operate in isolation. It worked directly alongside naval harassment, relentless tunneling and mining operations, repeated infantry assaults, and the systematic wearing down of the defenders' attention. The ultimate goal was not just to punch a single hole in the wall and hope for a lucky strike. The goal was to totally reduce the city's capacity to respond intelligently when the crucial opening finally came. This is the absolute mark of a serious strategist. Tactical success always matters, but complex systems collapse when they can no longer process shocks. Mehmed was taking deliberate aim at the defenders' decision-making architecture just as much as he was aiming at their masonry. As the brutal weeks of the siege wore on, the arithmetic darkened irreparably for Constantinople. External relief remained a phantom. European powers were distracted, politically divided, or simply hesitant to risk their fleets. Some minor aid did arrive, but not at the grand scale required to reverse the strategic equation. This too is one of history's hardest, most enduring lessons. Existential threats are often understood in principle yet entirely neglected in practice, because no single outside power ever believes the decisive hour has fully arrived. By the time it clearly has, military intervention becomes infinitely costlier and far less likely. The defenders of Constantinople were not abandoned in total ignorance. They were abandoned through incremental delay, cold calculation, and competing geopolitical priorities, the very ordinary machinery by which great civilizational disasters become possible. Before the final, climactic assault, Mehmed's logic sharpened into decisive concentration. Extreme pressure would be applied in a synchronized, unrelenting fashion to completely grind down both physical resistance and psychological resilience. Repeated, massive waves of attackers could force the exhausted defenders to spend men, energy, and attention with zero hope of replacement. Every boom of the bombard, every minor skirmish, every ringing alarm reduced the city's final reserve of organized response. A breach in the wall matters only if the defenders can no longer master it. Therefore, exhaustion itself became the Sultan's ultimate weapon. On the 29th of May, 1453, the final assault came. To describe that bloody morning as a single dramatic break would be profoundly misleading. The fall of the city was cumulative. Demographic weakness, financial exhaustion, long-term diplomatic failure, internal religious division, rapid technological change, and immense Ottoman state capacity all converged simultaneously on the exact same conclusion. The breach at the land walls did not mean that one lucky moment suddenly defeated the city. It meant that multiple, long-term civilizational systems had finally reached the point where they could no longer compensate for one another. Civilizations rarely die from a single blow. They die when every buffer they have fails at once. In the absolute crucible of the decisive fighting, Giovanni Giustiniani was severely wounded. The tactical significance of losing the primary defense commander was real, but the psychological significance was catastrophic. In extreme extremity, military lines often hold solely because a trusted figure embodies steadiness. When such a figure suddenly withdraws, whether by necessity, severe injury, or sheer confusion, entire sectors can instantly interpret the moment not as a local disruption, but as a general, fatal collapse. Cohesion in battle is a fragile, invisible architecture of belief. Once that architecture violently cracks, sheer numbers and individual courage alike begin to lose their coherence. Emperor Constantine XI entered the realm of legend in his death because his end perfectly fused personal courage with civilizational extinction. Historical accounts differ in their exact particulars, as they always do when grand regimes fall and myth immediately begins its work. But the enduring truth is clear enough. He cast off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets as his beloved city was overrun. That mattered immediately. When a state is far too weak to save itself, the physical body of the ruler often becomes the very last vessel of its legitimacy. Constantine's violent death did not preserve the empire, but it preserved something almost as important for the memory of the world: the image of a sovereign who flatly refused to outlive the final collapse of the ancient order he represented. Constantinople had fallen, yet the deeper event reached far beyond the act of conquest itself. The city long regarded as the immovable, sacred center of Eastern Christendom had been taken by a power that deeply understood how to combine ambition, administrative growth, military organization, complex engineering, and rapid technological adaptation. Eras do not turn merely because armies win battles. They turn because one form of political order proves decisively better able to convert its resources into violent action. That is precisely what happened in 1453. The immediate aftermath revealed Mehmed's much larger geopolitical intentions. He immediately transformed Constantinople into the new Ottoman capital, signaling not destruction for its own sake, but direct imperial succession. Conquerors operating at the highest level of history do not merely seize cities. They repurpose legitimacy. Mehmed did not seek only to remove a rival center of power. He sought to inherit imperial centrality itself. By making the city his capital, he announced to the world that the strategic and symbolic heart of the region would not disappear. It would simply change dynastic hands. This decision had profound, rippling geopolitical consequences. The Ottoman Empire emerged with unmatched prestige in the region, a strengthened, unbreakable command over global trade corridors, and a capital of extraordinary strategic depth. Europe now faced not a distant Eastern power to be dealt with through proxies, but a highly consolidated empire capable of sustained, organized pressure deep into southeastern Europe and across the Mediterranean world. The fall of Constantinople completely altered diplomatic calculations from the banking houses of Italy to the courts along the Danube. It redefined what the Ottomans were in the minds of their terrified neighbors. Not merely formidable adversaries, but the undeniable heirs to an imperial center long considered one of the world's greatest prizes. Culturally and intellectually, the reverberations were substantial, though often simplified by later storytelling. The migration of Greek scholars, philosophers, and ancient texts to the West did not single-handedly create the Renaissance. That grand movement already had deeper and broader roots in Italy. But the fall vastly accelerated the transfer of expertise, rare manuscripts, and a sense of intellectual urgency. More significantly, it intensified Europe's terrifying awareness that inherited assumptions about regional security, commerce, and the protective structure of Christendom were no longer tenable. A great Eastern bulwark, assumed to be permanent, had vanished in a matter of weeks. Global trade patterns, strategic military thinking, and deep fears of Ottoman expansion all gained terrifying new force. The military lesson was equally durable and completely changed the face of the earth. AD 1453 did not instantly end the Age of Walls. Fortification remained central to warfare for centuries to come. But the intricate relationship between walls, artillery, engineering, logistics, and state finance had been decisively and permanently altered. The future would belong increasingly to centralized states able to fund metallurgy, maintain specialist corps, organize massive supply chains, and constantly adapt fortifications to new realities. Stone alone was no longer enough. Defensive architecture would have to evolve drastically, because political survival now required integration between cutting-edge technology and a massive treasury on an unprecedented scale. The cannon did not merely break a city. It announced that warfare itself had become infinitely more expensive, more technical, and entirely dependent on the fiscal strength of the state. The political lesson, however, cuts much deeper still. Constantinople did not fall because courage was absent. Courage was present in breathtaking abundance. It fell because courage cannot indefinitely compensate for a profound structural weakness. Human societies are often fiercely, blindly loyal to grand symbols long after they have neglected the very institutions that defend those symbols. They revere capitals, elaborate ceremonies, flags, ancient faiths, and ancestral prestige. But reverence is not administration. Pride is not logistics. Sacred memory is not strategic depth. The Byzantines fought bravely for a civilization that had been shrinking and decaying for generations. But bravery, however noble, cannot restore vanished tax bases, reverse demographic contraction, or erase the accumulated consequences of delayed reform and fractured diplomacy. There was also a deep moral tension in the city's final days that no simplistic judgment can easily resolve. The siege forced impossible, agonizing choices between religious principle and diplomatic necessity, between core identity and desperate alliance, between dignity and compromise. Efforts at church union alienated many who genuinely feared spiritual surrender far more than political defeat. Resistance to such union, however, permanently weakened any prospects for meaningful Western military support. History offers no clean verdict here. It offers a tragic insight instead. Communities under severe pressure often discover far too late that existential threats punish internal purity tests more effectively than external enemies ever could. Principles absolutely matter, but politics constantly asks whether principles can be preserved at all if the very institutions carrying them are destroyed. In a larger philosophical sense, the fall of Constantinople marked the end of Rome not merely because an unbroken imperial line ceased to breathe, but because a whole model of organizing authority had finally reached the absolute limits of its viability. The Byzantine world had historically organized power through sacred monarchy, heavily fortified centrality, ceremonial universality, and deeply layered tradition. For centuries, that brilliant model achieved extraordinary resilience. But by the middle of the 15th century, it could no longer stand against massive states explicitly designed for scale, rapid cash flow, artillery, and adaptive ruthlessness. Rome did not end only at the physical breach in the wall. It ended because the surrounding world had already vastly outgrown the conditions that once made Roman continuity strategically sustainable. The verdict of history is therefore severe and highly instructive. Constantinople fell because an ancient prestige, however luminous and universally respected, could not survive without actual institutions equal to a changing age. Sultan Mehmed's victory was not merely a triumph of giant cannon over limestone walls. It was the victory of concentrated state capacity over exhausted inheritance. It was the victory of strategic integration over isolated magnificence. It was the triumph of a rising imperial system over a sacred capital whose brave defenders still possessed incredible courage, but no longer possessed any margin for error. The true cost of 1453 was not only the death of a city's last defenders or the extinguishing of an ancient emperor's line. The true cost was the final demonstration that civilization's grandest symbols, when detached from material renewal and structural strength, become nothing but invitations to stronger rivals. The modern mirror is uncomfortably clear, and it reflects our own times. Civilizations rarely perish in complete ignorance of the danger approaching them. Far more often, they perish in endless argument over which danger is real, which compromise is acceptable, which identity must remain untouched, and whether old prestige still counts as real power. States today still constantly confuse their soaring rhetoric for actual readiness. They still honor their core institutions publicly while quietly starving them privately. They still falsely assume that legitimacy inherited from a glorious past can substitute for difficult adaptation in the present. The fall of Constantinople endures in the human mind because its pattern is not medieval at all. It is permanently, tragically human. Societies see the storm gathering on the horizon, but they sit and debate umbrellas while the foundations themselves weaken and crack. And that leaves us with the ultimate legacy question, the one no dusty archive can answer on its own. When a civilization faces an unmistakable, world-altering transformation, what destroys it more completely? The enemy battering at the gates, or the internal, comforting conviction that preserving the old forms is exactly the same as preserving real strength? In the long shadow of 1453, that profound question still waits over every state, every institution, and every age that makes the fatal mistake of confusing memory for power.